Good morning. My name is Kit Kleinhans, and I am the Dean of Trinity Lutheran Seminary at Capital University. It's my privilege this morning to welcome you for the first lecture in a three-part series, Hush No More, Perspectives from Womanist Theologians. We have folks gathered here on Trinity's campus and well over 100 partners who are watching the live stream on our YouTube channel. So welcome to all, both in person and remote. Womanist theology centers the lives, experiences, wisdom, and voices of Black women as a vital source for doing theology. This three-part lecture series marks the start of a new collaborative initiative on womanist theology among the 7 seminaries of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, with which Trinity Lutheran Seminary at Capital University is affiliated. Students enrolled at any ELCA seminary will be able to cross-enroll in womanist courses offered at any other ELCA seminary. When space is available, these courses will also be offered as continuing education opportunities for women who are currently serving in ministry. The ELCA Womanist Theology Initiative is supported with funds from the Richard Hay Barkalow Fund at Thrivent Charitable Impact and Investing, and also with funds from the Justice for Women Office of the ELCA. I'm delighted to welcome this morning's speaker, the Reverend Dr. Elaine Brown Crawford. Dr. Crawford is a United Methodist pastor who earned a Ph.D. in Historical Theology from Union Presbyterian Seminary in Richmond, Virginia. She had the privilege of studying with 2 of the foremost womanist theologians, the Reverend Dr. Jacqueline Grant and the late Reverend Dr. Katie Geneva Cannon. Dr. Crawford is the author of the book, Hope in the Holler, A Womanist Theology. We're close enough to Appalachia here that I feel compelled to say holler is not that place there over yonder. Holler in the sense of yelling. Let me read just a few sentences from Dr. Crawford's book. African American women have lived in the echoes of their own holler. The holler is the primal cry of pain, abuse, violence, separation. It is a soul-piercing shrill of the African ancestors that demands the recognition and appreciation of their humanity. The holler is the refusal to be silenced in a world that denied their very existence as women. The holler is the renunciation of racialized and genderized violence perpetrated against them generation after generation. The holler is a cry to God to come see about me, one of your children. First time I read Dr. Crawford's words, I was reminded of a passage from the beginning of the book of Exodus, where we hear these words: "The Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out. Out of the slavery, their cry for help rose up to God. God heard their groaning, and God remembered God's covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God looked upon the Israelites, and God took notice of them." As we gather here today, Dr. Crawford will help us attend to the cries, the groans, the hollers, and to God's taking notice of those who cry, groan, and holler, and our call to do likewise. Please join me in welcoming to the podium the Reverend Dr. Elaine Brown Crawford.
Good morning, and thank you so much for that beautiful, very gracious introduction. It is so good to be here with you this morning. What an honor to participate in this trilogy of presentations on womanist theology. Hush, no more. I want to thank Dean Kleinhaus and for her gracious invitation to be here with you, for her gracious reception, for a delightful dinner last night, and just for your joyous presence that you bring to this campus and to this ministry. I want to thank my colleague in Womanist Musings, Dr. Beverly Wallace, also who was instrumental in my being here today. And I would be remiss if I didn't thank Tony Rowe-McCraw, who assisted me with all the details, all the questions regarding my presentation and being with you today. Thank you to you, students, faculty, staff, community leaders, womanist friends who are present here today in person, socially distanced and masked. Amen. And for those who are here via Zoom. So in this introductory lecture, I want to talk about theology that is shaping our future and impacting our world, womanist theology. In the brief time that we will share together this morning, I want to touch on its origins, its implications, and its impact in the church and in the academy. To do this, we really need about a semester, but I'll do it maybe in 30 or so minutes. And I hope that we will scratch the surface of your curiosity, that you will delve deeper into womanist thought. I want to lift up the theme of this conference, of these presentations: hush, no more. As Dean said, my work is grounded. I stand on the shoulders of first-generation womanist scholars. I studied with the late Katie Geneva Cannon. I traveled every week from Richmond, Virginia. I went by train from Richmond to Philadelphia to sit at the feet and the genius of Dr. Katie Cannon, to glean from her womanist wisdom. She was a brilliant scholar and funny, hilarious in the midst of teaching us. I remember one time she shared with us in class that her niece had asked her if she had an iPad. And Dr. Cannon's response was, "Honey, I'm past the change. I don't have any iPad." Some of y'all get that. Brilliant, but very funny, hilarious. Also during my doctoral work, I did research in Atlanta, Georgia, a special research year at the ITC, Interdenominational Theological Center, with the world-renowned Dr. Jacqueline Grant, a brilliant, brilliant scholar who has birthed many womanist scholars. She hired me after that research year to be the first coordinator of the Womanist Scholars Program at the ITC. I stand upon their shoulders. I'm their age or older, but I'm a second generation womanist scholar, thanks to the introduction to womanist thought by these two legacies. Womanist thought emerges at the intersection of Black liberation theology and second wave feminist theology. So I want to begin by briefly outlining these periods of time, and then we'll go a little bit deeper into the emergence of womanist thought. Although many people think that feminism was a singular school of thought that emerged fully in the 1970s, American feminism, in fact, has at least 3 waves, and some would say 4, successive waves in the United States, starting in the late 19th century. Please change the slide too. Starting in the late 19th, early 20th century, we talk about the first wave of feminism. The second wave of feminism occurs in the 60s, perhaps to the 80s. And the third wave began in the 1990s, early 2000s. Some say it was spawned by the Anita Hill Clarence Thomas trial. Rebecca Walker, the daughter of Alice Walker, was outraged as she watched the oppression of Anita Hill during those trials and the subsequent confirmation of Clarence Thomas. And she wrote a very scathing article in Ms. magazine. In that article, she ended by making a declaration: I'm not a post-feminist feminist, I am the third wave. Hence the third wave of feminism. Some would argue now that we are in a fourth wave of feminism that began around 2014, which focuses on primarily on sexual harassment, particularly in the workplace, body shaming, rape culture, and many other things, many other forms of oppression that women still labor under. Each of these waves of feminism concern themselves with particular social, political, economic, and cultural issues related to women. So now, as we move toward the emergence of womanist thought, I want to go just a little bit deeper into first wave and second wave feminism. As I said, we really need a semester to handle this. But first wave feminism emerges around the mid-19th century with the women's suffrage movement. It was particularly focused on the right to vote. At the 1848 Siena Falls Convention, abolitionists like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott boldly proclaimed the declaration of sentiments that said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. She wasn't necessarily talking about all women. Primarily, they were focused on the right to vote of white women. When Black men were given the right to vote around 1870s, 1880s, 90s, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was outraged that a field hand, a Black man, had the right to vote and women didn't still have the right. But as we know, history tells us that in the early 20th century, through the work of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and others, the 19th Amendment was passed, giving women equal access to the vote. This first wave of feminism was also concerned with other social political movements taking place at the time, such as abolitionists and the temperance movements. Yet, even in its earliest movement, feminism failed to address the concerns of women of color. Even in the 19th century, Sojourner Truth, in her now famous and stirring speech before the 1851 Ohio Women's Conference, noted the racial discrimination in women's status, even in the suffrage movement. Sojourner declared, "Ain't I a woman?" Do you know that speech? She says, "Ain't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns that no man could outhead me. Ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as any man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. Ain't I a woman? I've borne 13 children and seen most of them sold off in slavery. And when I cried out with a mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman?" Sojourner was keenly aware that the Voting Act's work and rights was on behalf of women. But as a Black female, she was not even seen as a woman. The second wave of feminism is typically seen as emerging in the 1960s and continuing to the 1990s, and was particularly concerned with the social movements occurring at the time. Things such as the anti-Vietnam protests, the civil rights movement. Figures like Gloria Steinem and Betty Friedan, the feminist mystique, are typically seen as prominent figures in this wave of feminism. They argued that women were still being relegated to unfulfilling roles in homemaking and childcare. By this time, many people had started referring to feminism as women's liberation. You may be familiar with that term, women's liberation. Critics argued that the benefits of the feminist movement, especially the second wave, were largely limited to white, college-educated women, and that feminism had failed to address the concerns of women of color, lesbians, immigrants, and religious minorities. Also emerging around this time period, coming on the scene, was the Black Power, Black liberation movement of the 60s and the 70s. Black Power was primarily concerned with racism. It emphasized racial pride and economic empowerment and Black cultural significance. It focused on the oppressive existence of Black people, primarily Black men in this country. In the academy, there were various responses to the Black Power, Black liberation movement. One of those responses came from James Cone, renowned theologian. He wrote a book entitled Black Theology and Black Power. In this seminal work, Cone did a systematic treatment of Black theology and connects it to Black liberation and Black power. In his next work, A Black Theology of Liberation, Cone focused on the oppression that Black people suffer due to the sin of racism and the forms of oppression. Dolores Williams and Jacqueline Grant were two of Cone's students. And they would later go on and raise the issue of sexism in the form of oppression of women in the academy, in the church, and in society. They even pointed out to Cone that in his early works, in his early writings, he focused primarily on racism and did not speak to or address the sexist oppression of Black women. So, feminists were primarily concerned with sexism. Black power, Black liberation was primarily concerned with racism. And for Black women, neither of those movements was adequate. Black women labored under what Dr. Jacqueline Grant called triple jeopardy or tridimensional oppression, sexism, racism, and classism minimally. Even in the academy, Black women such as Grant and Williams were pointing out that they had an experience, a lens, a vision, a voice that was not the same as Black men. Their unique lived experience was being overlooked. The unique experience of being a Black woman. Womanism emerges out of these two earlier movements, feminism and Black power, Black liberation. Feminism of the 50s and 60s were fighting for very relevant social political issues. Primarily their concern was with the sexism experienced by women, primarily white middle-class women. Though white women suffered victimization through sexism, they were still privileged by virtue of their skin color. They still had privilege in the midst of patriarchy. They could not and did not address the dehumanizing experience of racism and classism that Black people were dealing with on a daily basis. The Black power, Black liberation movement of the 60s called attention to the racism and classism perpetuated in this country, yet Black men were not addressing the sexism that Black women faced in the Black community as well as in the broader society. Black women were looking for their own movement, a movement that called attention to this tri-dimensional oppression of racism, classism, and sexism that they faced on a daily basis. Many Black women began to call themselves Black feminists as a way of designating support for the feminist movement, but at the same time calling attention to the experiences of Black women, which were not the same as those for white women. Black feminists did not advocate male bashing or any agendas that split the Black family. The residuals of slavery on the Black family had done enough of that. For many Black feminists, the name Black feminist was not a self-naming. It was a differentiated naming from white feminists. When Alice Walker published her book around 1984, her book was entitled In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, Womanist Prose. When that book was published, Black women in the Academy took note of the poetic, textbook-style definition of the word womanist. Walker took a Black cultural word, womanish, and gave it a positive, descriptive meaning of the experiences, the attitudes, the ways of being of Black women. Most Black women have probably at one time or another in their lives heard their mother, their auntie, their grandmother say, "You are acting womanish." It's a cultural word. Walker's four-part definition took this word womanish and gave it a positive meaning. I can give you an example. This will probably be bleeded out of the tape, but I'm going to give you an example of womanish. My mom had a friend, Miss Yvonne, that would come over to the house quite often, almost every other day, and they would sit out on the porch, and they had these beautiful glasses, and they would have some brown, strange-smelling liquid in those glasses. They would talk, and they would laugh, and they would talk, and they knew everything that was happening in the neighborhood. And being the inquisitive child that I was, I would play near them so I could hear what they were talking about. And later on, I would repeat part of their conversation. So my brother and I, as children do, were in a scuffle, a scrapple, and I decided that I was going to put what I had heard that day to work, to test. So I put my hand on my hip, and I told my brother if he didn't stop messing with me, that I was going to knock the hell damn it out of him. You could laugh. It's okay. And my mother's response was, "Girl, stop acting womanish. Stop acting that way." But Alice Walker takes that cultural word, womanish, and flips it and gives it a positive meaning. She said, womanist usually refers to courageous, audacious, outrageous, willful behavior, wanting to know more in greater depths than is considered good for you. She says that a womanist is a Black feminist or a feminist of color. A woman who loves other women sexually or non-sexually, appreciates and prefers women's culture, women's emotional flexibility, who values tears as much as laughter. Womanists sometimes love individual men, sexually and or non-sexually. A womanist is committed to the survival and the wholeness of the entire people, male and female. A womanist loves music, loves dance, loves the moon, loves the spirit, loves love, loves food and roundness, loves the struggle, loves the folk. A womanist loves herself regardless. She says womanist is to feminist as purple is to lavender. Like purple and lavender, feminism and womanism are similar, but they are not interchangeable. Womanist captures the essence of who we are as Black mothers, Black sisters and wives, scholars, partners, preachers, teachers, educators. It elucidates that we bring to our work a worldview, a lens that is unique to our experience. Womanists claimed the right to name our own work and activity. We claimed our naming for the experiences, the wisdom, and the wit of Black women. So womanist theology then emerged in the 60s and 70s to address the fact that much of theology that was being done in the academy excluded communities and scholars of color. And also, much of the early Black theology excluded the voice of women. Womanist theology was birthed by Black women who wanted to see themselves and the concerns of their communities addressed within theological discourse. They brought a new perspectival lens to theology. And Black women made up the majority, and as sometimes as much as 80 or 90% of the church, yet theology in the church nor in the academy was reflecting the experiences of its most faithful witness. Black women scholars across the disciplines, ethics, theology, biblical studies, began to write themselves into being. When I began studying womanist theology, you could count the theologians, ethicists, biblical studies, womanists on one hand. And now there is a proliferation of text. For instance, they started writing themselves into being. For instance, Dolores Williams wrote Sisters in the Wilderness, Challenges to Womanist God Talk. In that text, she argues that the Genesis narrative about Hagar provides a more appropriate biblical foundation for womanist thought, womanist hope, than the Exodus passages regarding the Israelites' liberation, which is traditionally used by Black liberation theologians. Hagar, she says, reveals the hope and the struggle with which Black women have worked through the issues of survival, surrogacy, motherhood, rape, homelessness, economic and sexual oppression. So she wrote regarding Sister Hagar. Kelly Brown Douglas, a brilliant scholar, wrote Sexuality in the Black Church, a Womanist Perspective. It was the first text to address the issue of homophobia within the Black church, still not often talked about. Jacqueline Grant wrote the text, White Woman's Christ and Black Woman's Jesus. Grant follows her teacher Cone in affirming the symbol of the Black Christ. Yet she pressed the symbol even further to include the lived experiences and the faces of Black women. She says in her seminal work that Black women affirmed Jesus as God incarnate, the divine co-sufferer. Black women share with Jesus the experience of suffering and oppression, she says. And certainly Dr. Katie Cannon, who wrote Black Womanist Ethics, she traces Black women's literary tradition to examine the importance, the moral wisdom of Black women like Zora Neale Hurston. Many women in the academy, the church, and the community claim this name womanist as an indicator that we are strong, that we are capable Black women who fight for social political justice, who bring our own perspective to life as a valid interpretive lens. We critique structures of domination and oppression inside as well as outside of our community. Black women across the ages have refused to be negated, abused, or silenced. We hush no more. The issue of womanist voice and visibility are at the forefront of my work as a womanist theologian. In my book, Hope in the Holler, A Womanist Theology of Hope, I note that hope is found through the voices, the writing, the activism of Black women. These elements played a pivotal role in enabling Black women to overcome a legacy of abuse in the church, in society, and in the academy. Black women have been what Francis Woods called the permissible victims of American society. Permissible victims. They were the persons who could be victimized with the least amount or no repercussions. Their existence has been scarred by the brutality and sexual exploitation of the Middle Passage, chattel slavery, as well as the pervasive institutional and social forms of race, class, and gender oppression that exist even to this day. As I conclude this introduction to womanist theology by talking a little bit about hope, I want now to solicit your involvement, your participation. I want to solicit you to engage in womanist ways of being, which is communal and responsive. So every time I say holler, I want you to say hush no more. I want you to let the Spirit lead you as to how softly or how loudly you proclaim it. But when I say holler, you say, good. Black women have lived in the echoes of their own holler. The holler is the primal cry of pain, of abuse, of violence, of separation. It is, as my book lifts up, that soul-piercing shrill of the African ancestors that demands recognition and appreciation of humanity. The holler is a refusal to be silenced in a world that denied their very existence as women. The holler is a renunciation of the racialized and genderized violence perpetuated against Black women generation after generation. The holler is the cry to God to come see about me, your child, your daughter. In my work, I went to the voices, the firsthand narratives, primary sources of Black women to glean their understanding of hope in the midst of the holler. Their narratives contain faith and hope as well as experiences of oppression. The content of their story shows the interweaving of the canonical story with Black women's story. Black women's lives, their experiences, and their interpretation of their experiences are thus valid theological sources. Dr. Katie Cannon argued that Black women's lives, their bodies, were the canvas upon which their experience of God had been written. The narratives of Black women document the living space that Black women etched out for themselves as they negotiated the intersectionality of race, class, gender, sexual oppression. Yet Black women continue to endure, survive, and transform oppressive existence. Womanist foundation, womanist hope is a foundational source of this audacity to survive the inhumanities and the injustices of life, the holler. The hope is an unquenchable thirst for that which is not yet. This womanist hope is characterized by a passion for life. Womanist hope, their passion for the possible in their lives, has been voiced and lived by women since slavery. This lived passion for the possible took different forms in different eras. In slavery, it was that quest for freedom and humanity. In emancipation, it was the quest for voice. Women managed their secrets with their pen. They wrote themselves into being. In the contemporary narratives, it was a quest for autonomy and equality. Yet in each era, the possible in their lives was understood as not only ultimate, but penultimate. Not only in the great by and by, but now in their lived reality. It was hope in spite of and in the midst of the holler. The narratives of Black women who have suffered victimization, abuse, and violence reveal a distinctive discourse about hope. Womanist hope, I argue, is a theological construct. not merely psychological, but it is a theological construct that moves these women beyond endurance and survival to ultimately transforming oppressive situations. Hope is a bridge from oppression to liberation, which facilitates full humanity and fosters that undaunted passion for life. They holler. While hope is not unique to Black women, hope does function distinctively in their lives due to their unique nature of oppression. I want to quickly just lift up William Jones' discussion of Black suffering. He's talking about Black suffering of Black people in general. He says that Black suffering has three essential features. Black suffering is, first of all, maldistributed. Maldistributed. That is, it's not evenly spread over humanity. Since Blacks are suffer disproportionately compared to others. He says that Black suffering is enormous in its severity. That is, it is life-threatening. It reduces one's life expectancy, one's ability to reach their full potential. It is non-catastrophic. It does not just strike and leave quickly, but it is transgenerational. It persists generation to generation. And so I argue that Black women have suffered even greater victimization of their bodies due to gender injustices and inequities. Thus, in the midst of their holler, Black women have had to formulate a distinctive hope to overcome this unique abuse. Their hope has to be maldistributed. It has to be present in an inordinate amount. From the voices of Hagar in the wilderness to Sojourner Truth to Harriet Tubman to Rosa Parks and Katie Cannon, they have encountered rampant oppression. So the hope has to be maldistributed. It is enormous. That hope has to be enormous in its ability to affirm humanity, to proclaim their presence, to foster their ability to reach unrealized potential, power, and passion. Their hope is transgenerational and non-catastrophic. That is, we've had to hold on to hope. We've held on to grandma's hope, to mama's hope, to auntie's hope. Hope has been that spiritual bridge for Black women to help overcome the oppression and the experiences of life. It interweaves our lives and voices and activism across the generations. Black women, they holler. Womanist theology affirms the theology of hope that liberates Black women, Black men, Black children, as well as humanity in general and the cosmos. We must continue to question, even challenge oppressive symbols, institutions, and paradigms that deny the humanity and empowering life for Black women. While many not so new issues like abuse continue to surface and to raise questions, the struggle for responses cannot be devoid of the biblical text, revisited and reconstructed and reimagined to speak to the experiences of Black women. Breaking the tyranny of silence in the church regarding the violence and invisibility and oppression of Black women is multifocal, but it begins by acknowledging that all humans are created in the image of God and are worthy of love. Love of neighbor, love of self, self-care are primary Christian mandates. They do not permit one to live only in the holler. One who loves does not beat or shoot or abuse their neighbor, or silently sit by and watch their neighbor be beaten or abused or murdered. Neighbor love prompts the church to action on behalf of the abused and the abusing. Self-care empowers us to remember that Jesus loved neighbor, us, loved us enough to become abuse and violence on the cross as a witness to a humanity that abuse and violence are his crosses to bear, not ours. Womanist hope is a bridge constructed with theological belief and social justice that binds and strengthens the community. This bridge of hope welcomes the Hagars, the Sojourner Truths, the Breonna Taylors, the unnamed women. The Say Her Name campaign brought awareness of the often invisible, unspoken names of Black women who are the targets of police brutality, sexual violence, and abuse. Women like Breonna Taylor. We knew the names of the men: Philando Castile, Michael Brown, Eric Gardner, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery. But what about the lives of the women? Kyla Moore, Aria Rosser, Alexia Christian, Maya Hall. Breonna Taylor's death and the death of many other Black women has not sparked the same outrage of the death of Black men. And the church and the academy must be at the forefront of this conversation in the pulpit, the streets, and in the voting booth. Lastly, the Womanist Bridge connects us to every Black woman, man, and child who has suffered and who seeks hope. This transgenerational spiritual bridge symbolizes hope that exemplifies our resolute refusal to die as victims, to live as victims, and our undaunted determination to live as vessels of hope. There is hope in the holler. Hush, no more. Thank you. Bless you.
At the beginning, Dr. Crawford mentioned that one could spend a whole semester studying womanist theology. The really good news is that you can. We have 2 more lectures this fall, and I just want to lift up again this introduction to womanism has provided a perspective that then can be applied in many other areas. So our October speaker, Dr. Angela Parker, we'll be using the womanist perspective to interpret the scriptures with regard to the experience of Black women. And our November speaker, whom some of you remember from this year's Trout Lectures, the Reverend Dr. Beverly Wallace, will be dealing with pastoral care from a womanist perspective. Unique lived experience matters, and a theology that addresses the needs of all people needs to do so by embodying the voices and experiences of each of us. So we have those two events coming up in later this semester, but also a semester-long course in womanist theology that will be offered in the spring, with the opportunity to delve much more deeply into these ideas and the ways they can be applied. As you join me once more in thanking Dr. Crawford, I also invite you to join us downstairs for a lunch catered by the Good Kitchen 614. This is a restaurant owned and operated by one of Trinity's students, Serena Travis. And even if you didn't RSVP, when I look around, I think there's going to be enough lunch for everyone. So if you like good soul food, come downstairs as our guests. And again, thank you so much, Dr. Crawford, for inspiring us.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Together in such short notice that we didn't have time to pre-order, but it is available on Amazon, and I'm willing to bet that Dr. Crawford would be willing to sign a little slip of paper, or maybe sign the program that when you buy the book you could slip it into your book. So thank you so much for the question.